Hello, everyone. My name is Ann Castle, and I'm going to talk today about the Colorado River Basin and some of the ways that water managers in the basin are addressing some of the challenges that they're facing to provide a comparison and maybe a contrast to the issues that all of you are dealing with in the ACF. I'm a lawyer by training. I practiced water law for almost 30 years in Colorado. And then I joined the Department of the Interior at the beginning of the Obama administration, where I was the Assistant Secretary for Water and Science. And in that role, I had the privilege of dealing with water policy issues all over the country. But I spent a lot of time thinking about and working on issues in the Colorado River Basin because there were a lot of challenges there. And now I returned to Colorado, left DC, and I'm with the Getches Wilkinson Center at the University of Colorado Law School. And I'm still working on Western water policy issues. People like you who deal with water issues know that rivers across the country are at the limits of their ability to serve both people and the environment. And we find that particularly in the Southwest, where climate change is having a dramatic impact on flows in our rivers. In the Colorado River Basin for the last 20 years, we've seen very substantially reduced runoff. And that experience has been the catalyst for some really creative agreements that would have been unthinkable before we were in the situation that we're in now. So I'm going to talk about some of the operational adaptations that have been made to deal with reduced flows, and also some of the mechanisms for dealing with environmental challenges. And I'll also talk about some of the lessons that we've learned along the way. So we always start with a map, right? This is a map of the Colorado River Basin. And you can see it's divided into two sections: the upper basin, which includes the states of Wyoming, Colorado, and Utah, and pieces of New Mexico and Arizona, and the lower basin that consists of Nevada, California, and Arizona. If you look at the dividing point between the upper and lower basin on the river, it's this point called Lee's Ferry. And that's an important point in the Colorado River Compact that governs the allocation of water between the two basins. Right above Lee's Ferry is Glen Canyon Dam. That is the dam that creates Lake Powell, and Lake Powell backs up from the dam in Arizona all the way into Utah. And then if you follow the river down, it goes through the Grand Canyon and down into the area near Las Vegas. That's where Hoover Dam is. That's the dam that creates Lake Mead, and that backs up a long way, even into the lower part of the Grand Canyon. And then the river continues down all the way into Mexico and ultimately into the Gulf of California. This is a similar map of the basin, but it just shows the areas outside of the geographic basin that are served by water from the Colorado River. So you see a lot of areas in Colorado, the whole Front Range that includes Denver and Boulder, Fort Collins, and then down into Colorado Springs and all the way down. This is the Arkansas River Basin. And you can see similar areas in other states. This is the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico that imports water from the Colorado River Basin. Same with Salt Lake City. And then these large areas in Southern California, the Imperial Valley here, and the whole Southern California coastal plain from Los Angeles down to San Diego. Some of the sound bites for the river system: it serves 40 million people. in the US and Mexico. And a lot of those people are in the red crosshatched areas that we just looked at on the map, outside of the geographic basin. So 7 states in the US, 2 states in Mexico. It irrigates about 5 million acres of farmland. There are 29 Native American tribes in the basin and 11 national parks. The economy that it supports has been estimated at $1.4 trillion. And that's a bit of a dated number. That might be 5 years old and a little low. And a significant part of the economic activity supported by the river is in the recreational industry. And that's a growing part of the economy. So the basic math on the river comes from the Colorado River Compact, which was entered into almost 100 years ago by the 7 basin states and the US government. And under that compact, the lower basin states, those 3 states of Arizona, California, and Nevada, get 7.5 million acre feet. And the upper basin states, the 4 in the upper river, get 7.5 million acre feet, but they bear the risk of shortage. So if there's not enough to go around, the deficit comes out of the upper basin. There was not an agreement with Mexico on the Colorado River when this compact was entered into in 1922, but the drafters of the compact foresaw that there would be an agreement with Mexico and provided that whatever deliveries were agreed to go to Mexico, they would be split equally between the upper and lower basins. And that happened in 1944. There was a treaty between the US and Mexico that provided for deliveries of 1.5 million acre feet a year from the US to Mexico at the border. And it also provided for reductions of that amount in the event of extraordinary drought. But extraordinary drought was not defined in the treaty, and that became the subject of a lot of controversy and discussion over the years. So just for context here, if you add up all the numbers that I just went through, 7.5 for the lower basin, 7.5 for the upper basin, 1.5 for Mexico, you come up with 16.5 million acre feet that were allocated by the compact and the treaty. The average flows in the river, however, have been over the course of our recorded data from 1906 to basically the present, those flows have averaged about 16 million acre feet. But more significantly, in the last 20 years, in the 21st century, the flows have been substantially lower, with an average of 13.2 million acre feet. So you can see we've got a problem. But we've got big reservoirs in the Colorado River Basin. Lake Mead is the largest reservoir in the country. It holds about 26 million acre feet. Lake Powell is the second largest reservoir with 24 million acre feet. And I put Lake Lanier down there just to sort of give you the scale. It holds a little over 1 million acre feet. So one of the problems that we've got in the Colorado River is that the flows are incredibly volatile. And you can see that from the bar chart here. This shows annual flows starting in 1964, going through the present. And there's just quite a lot of ups and downs. The heavy black line is the average, and this is Lake Powell inflow. So it's just the upper half of the river. And the average for the past 30 years has been 10.83 million acre feet. But the problem becomes a little more focused if you look at the period starting in the year 2000, so basically 21st century flows. And that average is substantially lower than the full period of record. And you can see that we're not getting much better here. This here was the flow from 2020, which was about 58% of average. And the colored bars are predictions for 2021. They're also very low. We're having another incredibly dry year. So our situation is not improving. So a basic water budget for the basin looks like this. Natural flows all the way up and down the river of 13.2 million acre feet. And again, that's a 21st century figure. We have outflows of about 15 to 16.5 million acre feet. So we've got a substantial deficit. And our reservoirs can save us, but not forever. Another problem that we face is that the projections for future hydrology are not great. There have been several studies that have projected a 20 to 30% reduction in river flows by mid-century. That's a reduction from 20th century averages, and even more dramatic reductions, 35 to 55% by 2100. There was just a new USGS study that came out last week that has similar numbers to it. So we have to prepare for even drier hydrology in the future. There have been multiple efforts to address the problem of lower flows, and I'm going to talk about them, starting with what we call the Interim Guidelines in 2007, a couple different agreements with Mexico, and most recently, a set of agreements called the Drought Contingency Plan that were entered into in 2019. So first, the 2007 Interim Guidelines were really a groundbreaking set of agreements among the 7 Colorado River Basin states and the Department of the Interior. They provide for sharing of shortage and surplus. There are provisions for sharing of surplus that turned out to be pretty optimistic and haven't been used. There is also provision for banking of water in Lake Mead in a form called intentionally created surplus. There are rules for the balancing of lake levels between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. You can see pictures of them on the right. And the Interim Guidelines entered into in 2007 and effective through the end of 2025. One of the most important provisions of the Interim Guidelines is the shortage sharing provisions that provide for reductions in deliveries to the lower basin states. And this is the table that embodies those rules for shortage sharing. So the first thing to notice is that the reductions in deliveries, which are shown in the body of the table, are based on elevation levels in Lake Mead. So as Lake Mead goes down and is reaching critically low levels, the lower basin states have their deliveries reduced. So these numbers under the state names are the full entitlement of the particular state to water deliveries from the Colorado River. And if you add up these numbers, you get to 7.5 million acre feet. That's the entitlement for the lower basin. So when Lake Mead is at elevation 1075 or below, Arizona's deliveries are reduced by 320,000 acre feet, Nevada's by 13,000. And you can see how the rest of this goes. So that was the first mechanism for dealing with the overall reduction in runoff and flows in the Colorado River system. Minute 319 with Mexico is an agreement that fleshes out operational details about how the treaty with Mexico will be administered. Minute 319 was signed in 2012 and was effective for 5 years. It addresses Mexico's taking shortages or reductions in delivery when flows are low. And it also allows Mexico to store water in US reservoirs, so they can determine not to take their full 1.5 million acre foot entitlement and store some of that water and carry it over for drier times in the future. It also provided for joint environmental efforts between the two countries. So Minute 319 expired in 2017, but it was replaced with Minute 323 that provided for even deeper cuts in deliveries to Mexico and was conditioned on agreement in the US on further reductions. That came in 2019 in the form of a drought contingency plan that was entered into by all 7 of the Colorado River Basin states. And it was done because the states recognized that the reductions in the 2007 guidelines were insufficient to deal with the reality of reduced flows that we were continuing to face. So the drought contingency plans provided for additional actions that were necessary to reduce the risk of getting to critical levels in both Lake Powell and Lake Mead. The contingency plan, or the DCP, was executed in May of 2019, and it goes through the same term as the 2007 interim guidelines. So it expires at the end of 2025. There's 2 components to the drought contingency plan, one for the lower basin, one for the upper basin. There's a new shortage sharing schedule for the lower basin states, and there's more opportunity and incentive for the storage of surplus water. So incentive for conservation. It's a relatively simple agreement, the lower basin DCP, but it required incredibly complex side agreements within the states and among the various water users to be able to carry it out. And this is the new shortage sharing schedule. So we went from a pretty simple 3x3 grid to this, and just some things to notice. It starts at a higher level in Lake Mead. The 2007 guidelines shortage sharing schedule started at 1075 elevation. This starts at 1090 in an effort to sort of get after the problem earlier in the occurrence of dropping levels. There's a column for Mexico, and this is the effectuation of the agreements in minutes 319 and minute 323. There's a column for the US Bureau of Reclamation, which has committed to finding water savings or purchasing water to provide to the system. And there's also a bunch of interim levels that didn't exist before between elevation 1050 and 1025, again, in an effort to try to ensure that Lake Mead doesn't reach critically low levels. The upper basin component of the drought contingency plan has 3 prongs. One is weather modification or cloud seeding that has actually been going on in the upper basin for a long time, and that will be continued and possibly expanded. There's also a provision for what are called drought response operations of other upper basin reservoirs upstream of Lake Powell. And what that means is that water could be released in slug releases from those upper reservoirs to make sure that Lake Powell doesn't get too low. And then there's a commitment to investigate demand management or conservation that would allow the upper basin to use less water, store the saved water in Lake Powell, and contribute to a sustainable system. So those are kind of the operational mechanisms. I want to talk briefly about some of the environmental issues that the basin has been facing and has addressed in different ways: salinity, endangered species, and general ecosystem degradation. So salinity has a couple of causes. There are naturally occurring salt formations along the river that get leached out by the river flows. There's also agricultural runoff. And salinity in the river, as I'm sure all of you have experienced, results in reduced agricultural production. And it also puts us potentially in violation of our agreement with Mexico, because we have to deliver a certain quality of water in that 1.5 million acre feet of delivery to Mexico. So a salinity control program was put into place in the 1990s. There's both a federal component and a state component. The funding for salinity control is used for cost share grants for projects that will reduce the salinity accruing to the river. It's about a $20 million a year program, sometimes more, sometimes less. And the source of that money is both federal appropriations that go through the Bureau of Reclamation and hydropower revenues from the various different hydropower generation units on the dams in the river. We also have a significant endangered fish issue within the Colorado River. There are 4 endemic species of fish that are listed as endangered, and the declines in their population have been attributable to water development, and specifically dams and lowered flows, and the introduction of non-native fish that compete with and prey on the native fish. So a jeopardy opinion with respect to these fish could have required very different operations of the dams in the Colorado River Basin, and that was a big concern. So in the 1980s, a recovery program was put together by the 3 Upper Basin states and the Department of the Interior. And that recovery program provides for a number of different mechanisms that are designed to try to recover the endangered fish species and to at least to maintain the populations as is. So in-stream flows, habitat development, fish stocking, non-native fish control, all of those are components of the recovery program. And that program provides a reasonable and prudent alternative in endangered species speak, so that the operations of the whole system didn't have to be modified. There's also problems that have been created by Glen Canyon Dam, which is the dam that creates Lake Powell. This is a picture of it. Just like any dam and reservoir, it has changed the downstream ecosystem by cutting off the natural spring runoff flows. And that's had adverse impacts on vegetation, on the fish, and on sediment distribution downstream from this dam. And downstream from this dam is the Grand Canyon, an iconic national park and environment. So a few years ago, what's called a high flow protocol was put into place for the operation of Glen Canyon Dam. And that provides for artificial flood flows from the dam when sediment conditions are right. There's a lot of sediment in the main stem of the river that can be redistributed up to the banks by high flows. So a chunk of water is released from these bypass tubes that you can see in the picture at Glen Canyon Dam, and that mimics what used to occur naturally. And those high flows can redistribute the sediment that's in the bed of the river up higher on the banks and the sides. They can build sandbars and they can scour vegetation that has encroached into the river channel as a result of not having those high flows. So next steps for the river, the interim guidelines, Minute 323, and the drought contingency plans all expire at the end of 2025. So discussions are already underway about what the next operational framework is going to look like. We have the opportunity to weave together both adjustments to deal with climate change and keep the river sustainable with the environmental mechanisms that have grown up along the way to try to create a better ecosystem environment. There have been some significant achievements in the Colorado River. We've had these voluntary reductions in demand and deliveries that are responsive to the hydrology that we're experiencing. The federal government, the 7 basin states, the country of Mexico, big water agencies, non-governmental organizations, environmental groups, they have all been involved in these discussions and to the benefit of the river. And part of the result of that is that there has been very little litigation. I won't say zero, but not much over the last 20 years. And there hasn't been interstate litigation in the US Supreme Court, which is a pretty big achievement. But the challenges are substantial. We have to deal with climate change and its anticipated further impact on runoff and flows. Tribal interests have not historically been part of the discussion in the Colorado River Basin, and that needs to change. We need to consider tribal water rights, tribal values with respect to water in connection with these operational agreements. And we also need to address the lack of access to clean drinking water on many of the reservations within the Colorado River Basin. And we have to do all of that without sacrificing the environment. So those are big challenges. It is not going to be particularly easy to deal with them. But I think the platform that has been built over the past many years and that's embodied in these various agreements is strong enough to support the process that needs to occur in order to accommodate all of those values in the future. So I will stop there and look forward to the discussion.